France, August 1944. Under a moon veiled in smoke and cloud, a convoy of olive-drab trucks winds through the shattered countryside. Their headlights are blacked out, their engines muffled under canvas. Dust rises from the road like breath from the earth itself. The men inside do not speak. They drive by instinct, by the faint red glow of the taillight ahead, and the endless hum of diesel engines that never seem to rest. The road is alive. Trucks grind forward 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There are no schedules, no pauses, no certainty that the next mile will be safe. Each vehicle is packed to its roof with jerry cans, 5 gallons at a time, stacked in precise rows like ammunition for an unseen weapon. The smell of fuel clings to the air. The drivers reek of gasoline and sweat, their uniforms stained with oil. What they carry is not cargo. It is the lifeblood of an army. High above, a German reconnaissance pilot circles in disbelief. Through his camera lens, the road below seems impossible, an unbroken vein of movement stretching to the horizon. He radios his command post in disbelief. It cannot be real. No nation, he insists, could move so much, so fast, with such relentless coordination. Yet what he sees is real enough. The trucks keep coming, mile after mile, from Normandy's beaches to the heart of France. By dawn, the column stretches over 700 miles. Each turn of the wheel feeds General George S. Patton's armored spearhead. Each gallon delivered means another tank moves, another town falls. Months earlier, in Berlin and Paris, German officers had laughed at the Americans, at their excess, their machines, their apparent dependence on fuel. "A gasoline army," they sneered, "an army of mechanics, not soldiers." Now that gasoline has become thunder. It roars across the French plains, turning ridicule into reality. The men in those trucks do not know it yet, but the road they travel, the road that should not exist, will soon decide the fate of Patton's advance, and with it, the shape of the entire war. But before this miracle of motion began, there was a moment when everything stopped. Only days earlier, General George S. Patton's Third Army had torn across France like a storm unbound. From Normandy to the Seine, his armored columns had advanced faster than any Allied planner had dared to predict. Towns fell in hours, bridges were seized intact, and the German front seemed to disintegrate before the roar of American engines. To many, it looked as if nothing could stop him. But in war, even the fastest blade dulls when it runs out of fuel. At the banks of the Seine, the miracle of speed came to a sudden and absolute halt. Tanks rolled to silence, their engines coughing out the last fumes of gasoline. Mechanics climbed onto Sherman hulls with wrenches and siphon hoses, draining what little remained from jeeps and half-tracks to keep a handful of vehicles alive. Dispatches from headquarters went unanswered. Radios crackled with reports of dry units stranded on open roads. In Patton's diary, the line appeared with bitter finality. "Our spearhead is out of gas." The pause was more than mechanical. It was strategic paralysis. The Third Army's momentum, its very identity, depended on motion. But behind the lines, the logistical system was collapsing under the scale of its own success. Eisenhower, commanding from Staff headquarters, faced a problem without precedent. 28 divisions advancing faster than the supply chain that fed them. Every tank, truck, and aircraft was now demanding what France could not yet provide: fuel, ammunition, food, and rest. The ports were still too distant, their docks shattered by months of bombardment. The French railways, once the arteries of Europe, lay in ruins. Fuel depots were empty, pipelines unfinished. For the first time since D-Day, the Allied advance had outrun its own lifeline. What had been a story of unstoppable momentum now stood on the edge of collapse. The generals who once measured victory in miles now measured it in gallons. In the fields beside the Seine, soldiers waited beside silent tanks, unaware that this moment of stillness would ignite one of the most ambitious and improvised operations in modern military history, and it would begin with an order that seemed impossible to obey. August 25th, 1944. From the command offices of Chaff, a single directive cuts through the exhaustion of war. Keep Patton moving, whatever it takes. The message travels down the chain of command like an electric current. No one asks how. They all understand what it means. The Third Army, the spearhead of the Allied advance, must not stop, but there is no plan, no railway, no port network ready to sustain the pace. The supply lines that fed the Normandy invasion have stretched to the breaking point, and the maps show no clear answer. The men responsible for solving it are not generals of fame or glory, but quartermasters, officers whose battleground is the ledger, whose weapon is the truck. They are told to move mountains of fuel, food, and ammunition without rest, without precedent, and without delay. Out of desperation comes invention. In a matter of days, a new artery of war begins to take shape. A continuous truck-only highway, running from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines. No civilian traffic, no interruptions, only motion. Its code name comes from the railroad term for priority freight, the Red Ball Express. The mission is audacious in its simplicity, to feed an army that consumes more than 800,000 gallons of fuel every single day. Every drop of that fuel must travel by road, across a ruined landscape still scarred by retreating German forces. The trucks will move by night to avoid Luftwaffe attacks, their headlights painted over, their drivers guided by instinct and faith. Most of those drivers are young. Many are untrained. Nearly 3/4 are African American soldiers, assigned to segregated units, denied combat, but now charged with sustaining it. They will drive, repair, and reload under fire, often without recognition. The world will remember Patton's tanks thundering across Europe, but few will remember the men behind the wheel. In that final week of August, the order that seemed impossible becomes the heartbeat of an army, and on those uncertain roads of France, history begins to move again. Before D-Day, in the smoke-laden rooms of Berlin's military headquarters, the architects of the Reich debated how the Allies would fight. Maps were spread, arrows drawn, and predictions made with the precision of chess masters. Their conclusions were unanimous. The Americans, they said, were not a nation of warriors, but of mechanics, a people of industry, dependent on their machines, too slow and too burdened by comfort to sustain a continental war. German intelligence reports reflected this arrogance in numbers and tone. Analysts described the American logistical model as overbuilt and under-disciplined. They believed that such an army, so dependent on supply, could never match the instinctive momentum of the German way of war. Blitzkrieg, the art of striking fast and decisively before the enemy could even respond. It was not a science of fuel and tonnage, but a doctrine of will and timing. To the German General Staff, victory came not from volume but from genius, from the intellect of command and the audacity of attack. In their view, speed was born of precision, not consumption. Fuel was a tool, not a necessity. They had mastered the formula of surprise and shock. What more could machines add to that perfection? Even Adolf Hitler himself, during briefings on the Allied buildup, dismissed the vast American supply fleet with a sneer. "They will drown in their own abundance," he said. To him, America's industrial might was an excess, proof of inefficiency, not strength. In the Führer's eyes, A nation that measured war in cargo tonnage could never match a nation that measured it in blood and belief. Yet behind this disdain lay an illusion, the illusion that genius could substitute for endurance, that strategy could ignore the mathematics of movement. By 1944, Germany's own armies were running dry. Their divisions fought without oil, their tanks stood abandoned in fields, and their vaunted blitzkrieg had slowed to a crawl. The art they worshipped was collapsing under the weight of its own elegance. What the German High Command never understood was that war, at its core, is a contest of momentum, not only of minds, but of matter. In 1944, that contest was about to be decided not by generals in map rooms, but by engines on the road. And on the other side of the channel, a different kind of army was learning how to make movement itself a weapon. The United States Army of 1944 was an army still learning how to fight a global war. Its officers had studied supply on paper, not in the mud. Many were former accountants, warehouse managers, and railroad clerks, men who measured victory in tonnage and timetables rather than in ground gained. To them, war was a question of numbers, how much could be moved and how quickly. But now those numbers were no longer abstractions. They were the lifeline of millions. From the beaches of Normandy to the banks of the Rhine stretched the largest supply line in human history, a living system of depots, convoys, and field stations that pulsed across a continent still burning from retreat. Every bullet, every ration, every gallon of gasoline began its journey on those beaches, where the tide delivered not soldiers, but crates, drums, and fuel cans. It was a war fought as much by paperwork and engines as by rifles and shells. The scale was staggering. The Allied advance consumed 12,000 tons of supplies a day, and most of it had to move by truck. The railroads of France lay in ruins, bridges were down, and locomotives destroyed. The only path forward was the open road, a road that had to remain alive no matter the cost, and behind the wheel of those trucks were the men the army had long kept in the background. Nearly 3/4 of the Red Ball Express drivers were African-American soldiers, drawn from segregated units, trained not for combat, but for labor. They wore the same uniforms, swore the same oath, and faced the same dangers, yet were told they would not fight. Instead, they would drive, through mud, fire, and exhaustion, because someone had to keep the tanks moving. They became the arteries of the front, the unseen pulse that kept the army alive. They drove through nights lit by distant artillery, past burning towns and broken bridges, carrying the invisible weight of a war that depended on them but rarely acknowledged them. There were no medals waiting at the end of their route, only another day, another load, another stretch of road to conquer. Yet it was their endurance, not Patton's fury, that sustained the advance. Without their hands on the wheel, the Third Army's charge across France would have ended at the Seine, its tanks silent, its legend unfinished. But within Patton's headquarters, another idea was taking shape, one that would turn movement itself into a weapon. General George S. Patton believed in one absolute truth: motion itself was a weapon. To him, the art of war was not defense, not deliberation, but movement, relentless, unbroken, and consuming. "Keep the tanks rolling," he told his officers. "We'll make fuel our bullets." It was both a command and a creed, the philosophy of a man who measured victory not in territory held, but in miles gained before the enemy could react. By the late summer of 1944, that creed came at a staggering cost. The Third Army consumed over 3 million gallons of fuel in a single month, enough to drain the reserves of entire nations. Every tank, jeep, and truck demanded more, and still Patton pressed forward. He understood that speed was psychological as much as strategic. It unnerved the enemy, distorted their maps, and shattered their sense of time. His men felt it too. Each dawn brought a new horizon. Each dusk, another river crossed. But behind the thunder of Patton's advance, the quartermasters fought their own invisible war. One measured not in glory, but in gallons. Every mile of motion had to be earned through improvisation. They calculated routes on paper maps, traced in pencil by flashlight, balancing tonnage against terrain. There were no computers, no automated systems, only judgment and nerve. Each delay, each broken bridge or misrouted convoy meant silence at the front. Tanks stalled, artillery cold, momentum lost. To those officers, Patton's gospel of speed was both inspiration and torment. They admired his genius, but they bore the weight of its consequences. Their task was impossible: to feed a moving army that consumed more fuel than could be shipped, more ammunition than could be carried. Yet in that impossibility, innovation began to take root. They learned to reroute supply columns through fields, to repair bridges on the move, to refuel tanks in open country without stopping. Necessity stripped away hesitation. Discipline replaced perfection. The U.S. Army, once mocked as mechanical and slow, was transforming into something new, an organism built for perpetual motion. Every man, from general to driver, became a cell in that living machine. In Patton's headquarters, maps changed faster than they could be printed. Arrows stretched beyond the reach of railways, beyond logic itself, but the general's demand remained the same: keep moving. And somewhere along those overburdened French roads, the quartermasters found their answer, not in theory or command, but in invention. Because when the roads failed, they would build their own. August 26, 1944. Dawn rises over the hedgerows of Normandy, and with it begins one of the most extraordinary undertakings of the war. From the beaches once choked with invasion craft, a new kind of army comes to life. An army of engines. 6,000 trucks, manned by 23,000 drivers, roll into motion. Together, they will move 36,000 tons of supplies every day. The operation has no precedent in military history. It is called the Red Ball Express. On maps spread across headquarters tables, its route is drawn as a single line, a red circle marking the highway from the ports of Normandy to the advancing front. In reality, it is a living artery, hundreds of miles long, pulsing with motion. Along this road, nothing else is permitted to move. Military police guard every intersection, clearing all traffic except the convoys. The rule is absolute. Once a truck joins the express, it does not stop until it reaches the front. The system is brutally simple. Trucks depart in endless columns, spaced at 50-yard intervals. Each carries fuel, rations, or ammunition, the three necessities without which Patton's Third Army would wither. Painted white stars glimmer faintly beneath layers of dust. At night, the convoys move with headlights blacked out, guided only by slitted covers that emit a thin, ghostly glow. The drivers follow the red markers nailed to roadside posts, trusting that the road ahead will still exist when they reach it. Engines never cool. When a truck halts, another driver climbs aboard to keep it moving. Sleep is stolen in fragments, 15 minutes on a tailgate, 20 against a steering wheel. Meals come from ration tins eaten one-handed while driving. The trucks themselves begin to smell of diesel, sweat, and fear. A scent the men will never forget. The danger is constant. German aircraft still patrol the skies, hunting by sound more than sight. Convoys scatter under strafing fire, regrouping minutes later, engines roaring back to life. Mines, ambushes, and collapsing bridges take their toll. Some trucks never return, marked only by the silence they leave behind. Yet the column never truly stops. Its rhythm becomes mechanical, hypnotic, a beating heart of steel that drives itself forward regardless of exhaustion or loss. Every driver knows that behind him are hundreds more, and ahead, thousands waiting for what he carries. Together, they form a single organism, an unbroken chain of movement feeding the war's momentum. To the soldiers at the front, the sound of those engines means life. To the men behind the wheel, it means purpose. They are not fighting in the traditional sense, but they understand something deeper. That motion itself is now the battlefield. Within days, the Red Ball Express becomes more than a supply route. It becomes a symbol of improvisation, endurance, and the strange kind of courage that asks for no recognition. What began as an emergency has evolved into a miracle of coordination, performed not by generals, but by ordinary men navigating chaos with nothing but instinct and will. And as August fades into September, that miracle must endure. For the road ahead is growing longer, the needs greater, and the enemy more desperate. But behind the wheel of these trucks, a new brotherhood is forming. Men of different colors and origins, united by exhaustion, by danger, and by the endless road that will soon define them all. They came from every corner of America, from the red clay roads of Louisiana, the pine fields of Georgia, the steel towns of Ohio, and the crowded streets of New York. Most had never seen Europe before the war, and few had ever imagined that their battlefield would be a steering wheel. They were truck drivers in uniform, soldiers without medals, men whose courage was measured not in kills or victories, but in miles. Nearly 3/4 of the Red Ball Express drivers were African American. In the segregated barracks of 1944, they lived apart from the white soldiers they served beside. They ate in separate mess halls, slept in separate tents, and knew that no matter how far they drove, equality would not be waiting for them at the end of the road. Yet once their engines started, the divisions disappeared. On the road, there was only one color, the deep olive of their trucks, the dust that coated everything, and the darkness that swallowed the night convoys whole. They gave themselves a name that captured both pride and exhaustion: the Hall or Nothing Men. The motto wasn't official, but it spread through the columns like a quiet oath. They drove through mud that could bury tires to the axle, through rain that turned roads into rivers, through fatigue that blurred vision and dulled reflexes. Sleep was a luxury. Survival was a matter of rhythm. The hum of the engine became their heartbeat. Fatigue was the enemy that claimed more lives than gunfire. Men would drive 20 hours without pause, their eyes fixed on the faint red tail light ahead. Some fell asleep at the wheel, their trucks sliding silently off the road into fields or ditches. Others met danger head-on. German patrols, mines, and snipers who knew that every truck destroyed meant tanks left stranded at the front. The death of one driver could halt the advance of a division. Yet they did not stop. Few complained. In letters home, they rarely mentioned the danger or the discrimination. What they described instead were the roads, the endless stretch of them, the monotony, the mud, the strange beauty of dawn, breaking over a convoy still in motion. They knew, even without being told, that history was rolling behind them. Some found small ways to reclaim dignity. They painted names on their trucks: Iron Sally, Miss Victory, Georgia Peach. They played swing records on portable radios when the engines cooled. They laughed where they could, prayed where they must, and learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the persistence of motion despite it. Every load delivered was a silent victory. Every gallon of fuel meant another tank that could fight, another town that could be liberated. They were the invisible partners in Patton's legend, men who would never stand on the podiums of history, but whose tire tracks marked the path to victory. One driver, resting beside his truck after 72 hours on the road, summed it up with quiet pride. "If Patton moves, it's because we never sleep." By the end of August, the Red Ball Express was no longer an experiment. It had become a living system, one powered by endurance, ingenuity, and a generation of men whose names history almost forgot. But the machines they drove were beginning to bear the cost of that endurance, and soon the very roads they relied on would start to crumble beneath them. By September, the miracle of motion was devouring itself. The Red Ball Express, built to keep an army alive, was now tearing apart the very land it depended on. The roads of France, narrow, scarred, never meant for such traffic, began to crumble under the constant weight of 6,000 trucks. What had once been smooth macadam turned to gravel, then to dust, then to trenches of mud. The machines that carried victory were mile by mile consuming the path to it. Tires shredded in the heat of friction, axles snapped without warning, engines seized after days of non-stop use, their oil long since burned away. Bridges collapsed beneath overloaded convoys, sending trucks tumbling into rivers or fields. The noise was unending, the deep-throated growl of diesel, the metallic clang of repair, the shouted warnings of men too tired to stop. The Red Ball Express was no longer simply a supply line. It had become a force of nature, unstoppable yet fragile, grinding itself to pieces in the process of success. The army learned to adapt in motion. Mechanics rode with the columns, perched on the tailgates of moving trucks, ready to jump down and repair what broke. Engines were stripped, patched, and restarted without ever halting the flow. Drivers became their own engineers, learning to change tires by touch, to fix transmissions in the dark. Every man carried tools, wire, and spare belts. A rolling workshop that could resurrect a truck with nothing more than ingenuity and will. Each vehicle took on a life of its own. The men named them as one might name a comrade: the Old Lady, Miss Victory, Iron Sally, Black Mary. The names were painted in white across hoods and doors, a small defiance against anonymity. A man could change trucks a dozen times in a week, but the one he named, that one he remembered. Some even swore the trucks had personalities: stubborn, loyal, temperamental, alive. The sound of the convoys became a kind of language. Diesel mixed with gospel music from makeshift radios, the rhythm of engines blending with the call and response of tired voices. Fear and laughter shared the same road. One moment a convoy might sing. The next, it would scatter under the rattle of German strafing fire. Then, just as suddenly, it would reform, engines coughing back to life, the hymn continuing as if nothing had changed. What began as chaos began to find its rhythm. The men learned to move not by orders, but by instinct, each driver sensing the pulse of the column, the timing of gear shifts, the distance between headlights. Out of exhaustion came synchronization. Out of synchronization came efficiency. Somewhere along the battered routes of northern France, the Red Ball Express ceased to be an operation and became something larger, a living, breathing rhythm of war. The trucks no longer waited for instructions. They existed in perpetual motion, sustained by routine and belief. The road, for all its breaking, became their world, and in that world of endless noise and motion, victory was no longer measured by distance or tonnage. It was measured by endurance, by the will to keep moving when everything beneath them was collapsing, because as the roads gave way, the men behind the wheel refused to. And soon, that endurance would fuel the single fastest armored advance of the entire war, the moment when gasoline itself became the weapon that broke the Reich. By early September 1944, the roads of France had become rivers of steel. The Red Ball Express, once an improvised solution to a crisis, now pulsed with the rhythm of inevitability. Day and night, its convoys flowed eastward, delivering fuel faster than any army in history had ever consumed it. What had begun as an act of desperation had transformed into the bloodstream of a campaign, and at its receiving end, General George S. Patton's Third Army was once again in motion. Each of Patton's tanks now carried within it not just gasoline, but the willpower of thousands of unseen hands. Every jerrycan had been lifted, filled, hauled, and guarded by drivers who barely slept. Each gallon that reached the front was the product of human endurance stretched to its limits. The Third Army's speed, 400 miles in just 2 weeks, was no miracle of machinery. It was the cumulative result of exhaustion, discipline, and faith. As the American columns surged toward the German border, observers struggled to understand how such a feat was even possible. Reports from the front spoke of tanks that never seemed to rest, of infantry supported by endless supplies, of a logistical tempo that defied reason. German field commanders, trained to see war as a contest of calculation, began running their own figures. They added up the tonnage required, the distances crossed, the time elapsed. The math was impossible. To them, no army could move this far, this fast, without collapsing under the weight of its own needs. They assumed that somewhere behind the front, the Americans must have captured hidden fuel reserves or commandeered intact railways. But the truth was stranger and more humbling. The fuel came not from conquest, but from the ordinary courage of drivers they would never see. Behind every tank that thundered forward, 10 men were working in silence to keep it alive. Mechanics, loaders, dispatchers, guards, and the drivers of the Red Ball Express. None of them wore medals or carried rank beyond their shoulders, yet they were the invisible partners of every victory. Their world was the open road, their weapon the truck, their mission endless motion. Even Patton, who rarely shared credit, understood the link between his armored thrusts and the convoys that fed them. "My men can eat their belts, but my tank's gotta have gas," he said. He knew that without fuel, courage was useless, and without those drivers, his legend would end in the fields of France. From the air, Allied reconnaissance pilots saw something extraordinary, an unbroken stream of trucks stretching from the beaches of Normandy to the front near Metz. The convoys moved like veins across the landscape, glinting in the sun, their paths twisting through ruined villages and shattered bridges. To the Germans who observed from a distance, it seemed mechanical, even inhuman, as if the Americans had found a way to make movement itself their weapon. But there was nothing mechanical about it. Inside every cab sat a man fighting fatigue, praying the next bend didn't hide a mine, a sniper, or an ambush. The roar of engines hid the pounding of hearts. Many never reached their destination, but for each truck that fell silent, another took its place. The road, battered, rebuilt, repaired, absorbed them all. And as Patton's tanks rolled eastward, the German disbelief deepened into dread. They were facing an enemy that no longer fought by the old rules of attrition or pause. The Americans had turned abundance into endurance, logistics into momentum, and motion into strategy. By the time Patton crossed the Moselle River, his tanks were running on fuel that had been hand-carried across a continent. It was not merely gasoline that propelled them, but faith, the unspoken understanding that behind every engine, thousands labored unseen, sustaining the impossible. And somewhere in Berlin, the men who once mocked the gasoline army were beginning to realize that the joke was no longer theirs to tell. In the ruins of captured command posts across France, Allied intelligence officers sifted through German diaries and field reports, pages written in confident strokes only months before. One line appeared again and again, recorded by interrogators with quiet fascination. "The Americans think trucks win wars." The tone was mocking, certain. To the German officer corps, that single sentence captured the arrogance of a nation that measured strength in machines instead of genius. For years, German generals had believed that war was a contest of intellect, of doctrine, of speed born from precision, not from abundance. They had built an army where every movement was calculated, every advance the product of planning so exact that victory seemed inevitable. But by September 1944, that illusion was collapsing. Their tanks were stranded, their fuel drums empty, their once fluid blitzkrieg reduced to a crawl. What had begun as mockery had turned into prophecy. On the Western Front, entire panzer divisions sat abandoned in the countryside, their crews stripped off insignia, fled on foot, or waited in silence for fuel that would never arrive. The same officers who had laughed at America's gasoline army now watched their own engines die in the fields of France. It was not the thunder of artillery that broke them, but the quiet exhaustion of empty tanks, the sound of power fading into stillness. Meanwhile, across those same roads, Patton's Third Army was still moving, faster, louder, more relentlessly than ever. His Shermans devoured miles, as if hunger itself were propelling them. Every shell fired, every town liberated, every bridge crossed was made possible by a convoy hundreds of miles behind the front, a convoy that never stopped. It was not glamour that sustained the offensive, but grit. The unending procession of trucks, tires, and fuel cans had become the beating heart of victory. The irony was almost mathematical. The Germans had written that no army could maintain such momentum without breaking its own spine. But the Americans had done exactly that, by replacing rigidity with improvisation, doctrine with motion. Where Germany's strategy was defined by perfection, America's was defined by flexibility. When rails were destroyed, they built roads. When roads collapsed, they drove through fields. When fuel ran short, they made more. The Red Ball Express was not an act of genius, it was an act of endurance. And endurance, not brilliance, was now winning the war. Captured officers struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. Their reports back to Berlin spoke of an enemy whose mobility defied every rule of warfare. The Americans, they wrote, fought as if logistics itself had become their strategy, as if the movement of supplies was the campaign, and battle merely its consequence. For the first time in modern war, the power of intellect had met the power of industry, and industry was winning. The transformation was philosophical as much as tactical. The Red Ball Express had turned mockery into mastery, proving that victory belonged not to the army with the most genius, but to the one that could move the longest, the farthest, and the fastest. In the same way that radar had changed the air war and code-breaking had reshaped intelligence, logistics had quietly redefined generalship. It was a new kind of warfare, one measured not in heroism, but in horsepower. Back in Berlin, the tone of reports changed. Gone were the jokes about gasoline soldiers. In their place came confusion, even fear. Commanders wrote of the Americans' endless convoys, of columns that stretched beyond the horizon, of tanks that never stopped advancing. They began to realize that the weapon they had ridiculed was not the tank or the truck. It was motion itself. The Americans had made movement a form of dominance. By the time the Allies reached the German border, the laughter had stopped entirely. The diaries that once mocked now read like confessions, admissions of a truth too late to change. The road, not the rifle, had become the new battlefield, and in that transformation, the Red Ball Express had achieved something no one had foreseen. It had turned supply into strategy, and strategy into speed. But even victory had its price, and for the men who drove the endless road, that price was still being paid in exhaustion, in danger, and in silence. Section 12. The price of motion, 700 words. Victory, when it came, was measured in miles, but every mile carried a cost. The Red Ball Express had succeeded beyond imagination. It had kept the tanks moving, the artillery firing, and the Allied momentum unbroken. Yet beneath the statistics of tonnage and distance lay another story, one written in exhaustion, in shattered machines, and in the quiet endurance of men who had nothing left to give. The convoys never truly stopped. Orders from headquarters were explicit: keep rolling or die trying. For the drivers, that phrase was not hyperbole. Fatigue became as dangerous as enemy fire. Men at the wheel fell asleep mid-turn, their trucks veering off the road into ditches or barns. Entire convoys sometimes awoke to find one of their own missing, the wreckage discovered miles later, scattered among fuel drums and twisted steel. There was no time for mourning. A replacement driver climbed into the next cab, and the column moved on. Rain became a second enemy. When the autumn storms came to France, the roads, already crumbling under the weight of 6,000 trucks, dissolved into rivers of mud. Tires spun uselessly, engines overheated, and bridges that had held for weeks suddenly collapsed beneath the strain. A single broken span could halt hundreds of vehicles, each filled with fuel or ammunition too precious to abandon. Men waded waist-deep through flooded roads to guide trucks forward, their boots filling with freezing water, their bodies shaking from exhaustion. Accidents claimed hundreds. The trucks were overloaded, the routes treacherous, and visibility often reduced to a few yards. Convoys collided in the night, fuel trucks ignited, and the resulting infernos turned the French countryside into scenes of unrecorded tragedy. The army kept few statistics. The mission's urgency left no time for record-keeping. What mattered was movement, the relentless forward pulse of supply, no matter the human toll. For the men inside the cabs, fatigue became a kind of madness. Some began to hallucinate, swerving to avoid phantom lights or shadows that weren't there. Others talked to their trucks as if they were living beings, coaxing them up hills and through storms. Meals became handfuls of cold rations, eaten one-handed. Rest was taken in fragments, a few minutes on a steering wheel, a nap against the door of a running engine for warmth. When the convoys finally did pause, men simply collapsed. They slept in ditches, under trucks, even standing, leaning against the wheels they had turned for days. Some woke unsure of where they were, others didn't wake at all. To those who commanded them, the operation looked like triumph. To those who lived it, it felt like survival by inches. The Red Ball Express had achieved the impossible. It had kept Patton's Blitz alive, carried the weight of an army, and reshaped the future of logistics. But for the drivers, victory was measured not in maps or medals, but in endurance. They had given everything: strength, sleep, and sometimes life itself, to sustain a war that would not stop moving. Even triumph, they learned, carried exhaustion as its shadow. Every road conquered demanded something in return, and though the headlines would celebrate Patton's advance and Eisenhower's strategy, the men behind the wheel knew the truth, that no victory, no matter how brilliant, was ever free. As autumn deepened and the first hints of winter settled over the roads of France, the engines of the Red Ball began to slow. The mission had changed the war, but the war had changed them too. And in the silence that followed, a new realization began to take shape, that logistics was no longer a means to victory. It was victory itself. By December 1944, the Red Ball Express had carried more than 400,000 tons of supplies across the scarred face of France. Fuel, rations, ammunition, and hope, all delivered by men who had long stopped counting the miles. It was an achievement without precedent, born not from planning, but from persistence, sustained by a will that refused to break. And though the headlines spoke of liberated cities and advancing armies, the quiet truth was this: without the Red Ball Express, there would have been no advance at all. As winter closed in, the front hardened into a new and desperate struggle, the Battle of the Bulge. German forces, striking through the Ardennes, sought to sever the Allied supply lines and drive a wedge between American and British armies. Snow covered the landscape, fuel froze in barrels, and for a moment, the momentum that had defined the Allied war machine began to falter. But once again, the road came to life. The same trucks that had crossed France in summer heat now clawed their way through ice and darkness, carrying everything from artillery shells to blankets. Without them, the counter-offensive that saved the Western Front would have ended before it began. The Red Ball drivers had become veterans of motion. They no longer waited for orders. They anticipated them. They knew the roads by instinct, the curves by memory, the bridges by feel. Many drove trucks older than themselves, patched with scavenged parts, held together by wire, oil, and faith. In those months, the Express was less an operation than a heartbeat, irregular, strained, but alive. It kept Patton's Third Army supplied during the most dangerous winter of the war, when cold and chaos conspired to slow everything to a crawl. And yet, when the guns fell silent and Europe was free, no parades awaited these men. There were no medals pinned for miles driven, no monuments raised for gallons delivered. When the last convoy rolled home, its drivers received only their discharge papers and a return ticket to a country that had scarcely known their names. Their trucks were dismantled, their routes erased from maps, their achievements buried in the footnotes of official reports. History, like command, had a short memory for the invisible. But among those who understood logistics, the officers who had watched an army fed and fueled by willpower, there was quiet acknowledgement. In letters and diaries, the words appeared with understated reverence. "They drove history forward," one colonel wrote. "Without them, our victories would have been measured in yards, not miles." Another officer, reflecting after the war, called the Red Ball Express the proof that courage can run on wheels. For the men who had driven it, that was enough. They knew what they had done, even if the world did not. They had seen the war from its most elemental angle, not as strategy, but as survival, not as heroism, but as endurance. They understood that courage was not always found in battle, but sometimes in motion, in the act of carrying forward when everything around them was breaking down. When historians later tried to explain the speed and reach of the Allied campaign, they spoke of Patton's brilliance, Eisenhower's coordination, and American industry's vast capacity. But beneath all of that was something simpler, more human, a network of men and machines, bound by the unspoken belief that progress, once started, must never stop. The Red Ball Express had no anthem, no flag of its own, yet it embodied the American way of war, an improvisation that became innovation, a necessity that became strength. And as the trucks disappeared from the roads of Europe, the lessons they left behind would begin to take shape. Lessons that would redefine not only how wars were fought, but how they were sustained. When the war ended, the maps were folded away, but the lessons of the Red Ball Express remained open, written not in ink, but in movement. In the years that followed, military analysts and historians turned back to study the operation that had kept an army alive. What they found was not just a logistical miracle, but a revelation. The Red Ball Express had proven that in modern warfare, improvisation could be as decisive as strategy. It was not the result of careful planning, but of necessity turned into method. From those improvised roads of 1944 came a new doctrine, quietly adopted across the U.S. Army. Supply first, strategy second. It was a reversal of centuries of military thinking. No longer would logistics follow the plan, it would be the plan. Generals began to understand that the ability to move, to adapt, and to sustain momentum was the real foundation of victory. The Red Ball Express had not just delivered fuel and ammunition, it had delivered a new philosophy of war. In staff colleges and command schools, instructors pointed to it as a case study in operational flexibility. The lessons were clear: speed demands simplicity, coordination demands improvisation, and morale depends not only on courage, but on continuity. The belief that the next meal, the next shell, the next gallon of fuel will arrive no matter the odds. The Red Ball's success redefined the American way of war: fast, mobile, industrial, and relentlessly supplied. That same philosophy would echo across the decades to come. In the frozen mountains of Korea, supply convoys snaked through snow and ice to feed an army cut off by terrain and weather. In the deserts of Iraq, fuel tankers stretched from horizon to horizon, repeating the same mantra: keep it moving. Each conflict carried the same invisible signature: the DNA of an operation born on the roads of Normandy. The Red Ball Express had become more than a wartime improvisation. It was now a lineage, passed quietly from one generation of soldiers to the next. For the men who had driven those roads in 1944, the transformation was distant and abstract. Most returned home without fanfare. They didn't lecture about doctrine or innovation. They rarely spoke of what they had seen. When asked, they said only that they did what needed to be done. They did not call themselves heroes because they had never stopped to think of heroism. There had been no time for reflection, only the next mile, the next load, the next dawn. Yet their silence spoke of a deeper truth, that greatness in war often hides itself in routine. Their courage was not the courage of battle, but of endurance, the quiet discipline of movement. It was the courage to keep going when the road was broken, when fatigue dulled the senses, when recognition would never come. Decades later, when new wars demanded new innovations, military historians still trace their lineage back to those anonymous convoys that once crossed France. The trucks were gone, the men aged and scattered, but the idea they had embodied endured: the belief that mobility itself was power, that the ability to move could decide the fate of nations. The Red Ball Express had begun as an emergency, sustained as an experiment, and ended as a doctrine. It was proof that victory was not only forged in combat, but built mile by mile on the endurance of ordinary men. And somewhere beneath the layers of post-war analysis and military theory, one truth remained unchanged: that history moves forward only when someone is willing to keep driving through the night. In the early years of the war, German generals had laughed at the Americans. They mocked their obsession with machinery, with logistics, with what they called industrial war. To them, the American soldier was not a warrior but a mechanic, dependent on his trucks, his fuel, his endless supplies. "They fight with gasoline," one German officer sneered. "Without it, they are nothing." In those words was a belief older than the war itself, that victory came from will and genius, not from resources. The German High Command saw itself as the heir to a martial tradition of precision and daring, of commanders who bent fate by intellect alone. In their view, abundance was weakness, efficiency was strength. They believed that courage was measured in risk, not in the tonnage of supplies moved across a continent. But by the autumn of 1944, those convictions had collapsed under the weight of reality. The armies of the Reich stood still, their tanks useless, their airfields silent. Their will was unbroken, but their engines were empty. What they had dismissed as material excess, gasoline, trucks, spare parts, had become the lifeblood of modern war. And it was the Americans, with their convoys of olive-drab trucks, who had mastered that truth first. Gasoline had carried genius to the front. It fueled Patton's tanks, Eisenhower's advance, and the steady, grinding progress of an army that refused to stop. Each mile conquered owed itself to the invisible road behind it, the road built by the Red Ball Express. Those who once laughed at America's gasoline army now watched that same gasoline turn into thunder, sweeping across France and into the heart of Germany. The Red Ball Express turned mockery into momentum. It proved that movement itself could be a form of warfare, that an army which never stops cannot be defeated. Its convoys, once dismissed as mechanical drudgery, became the pulse of victory. Every jerrycan carried was an act of endurance. Every mile driven was a declaration that adaptability, not arrogance, wins the future. In the post-war years, military theorists would search for the secret of Allied victory. They spoke of code-breaking, of air superiority, of industrial output. But beneath all those triumphs ran a simpler truth, that the side which could move, endure, and rebuild faster would always outlast the side that could only plan. The Red Ball Express was not born from genius or ideology. It was born from necessity, and it proved that necessity is the truest form of innovation. For the men who drove those trucks, there was no philosophy, only duty. They did not speak of destiny or strategy. They simply kept moving, knowing that every wheel turned pushed history forward. Their courage was not cinematic. It was measured in fatigue, in persistence, in the knowledge that their contribution might never be remembered. And yet, through their motion, an empire fell. In Berlin, where the laughter had once echoed, silence remained. The generals who had mocked logistics now faced the irony of their own defeat, undone not by lack of bravery, but by lack of movement. The army that believed in willpower had been overtaken by the army that believed in wheels. The Red Ball Express was more than a supply route. It was a lesson that wars are not won only by strategy or steel, but by motion, by the quiet discipline of those who keep the engines running when everything else has stopped. They laughed at the trucks once. They never laughed again.